Chapter 10. Strapping on Ghosts. The impact knocked her sideways against the wall of skins, and Zoe recoiled, found her equilibrium, and brushed off the scuttling, hard-shelled beetles that clung to her skin before they could sink their hungry little mouthparts into her. The things fell to the deck, scuttled blindly for an instant, and then vanished between the cracks, as if the Whippet's ship were just another corpse for their investigation. Below her feet, the engines had fallen silent. In the stillness, she sensed the Mirocaw resigning itself to gravity, redistributing the vicissitudes of torque through its 1,000 tiny joists and connectors with a deep and exhausted sigh. Zoe still couldn't tell if they'd crashed, or if it had just been a rough landing. She waited, scarcely breathing, as the thrusters cooled, ticking and ultimately falling silent. From outside, she could hear the wind. The sound brought with it a kind of alien desolation that seeped in from somewhere outside the Durasteel-reinforced hull. She felt the skin on her back tightening with a shiver. It felt as if they'd landed in some windowless crawl space in the bottom of the galaxy, a place inexorably devoid of entrances and exits. Her gaze flicked back to the orchid, hoping for an explanation, a means of understanding what she felt. "Something's gone wrong out there," she thought. "Can you feel it?" Across the room, the vacuum-sealed gasp caught her by surprise. The Whippet was standing in the open hatchway again, clutching his spear in one hand and a bunched-up bundle of furs and hides in the other. He tossed the furs at her feet. "Put those on." Zoe didn't budge. "What are we doing here?" "Get the plant." "Are you going to answer me?" He turned and stalked out again, this time leaving the hatch open behind him, an unspoken demand to follow. Was there some other component to his brusqueness besides just impatience? Was the bounty hunter as uneasy as she felt? Zoe looked down at the pile of furs and pelts. They had been stitched into crude mittens, boots, a hat, and what looked like a kind of cloak. Squatting, she pulled the boots over her feet and found that, despite their bulkiness, they fit well enough when she lashed them tight around her ankles. They were recent kills, she realized. She could still feel the residue of the lives that had worn them as skin. It was like strapping on restless layers of ghosts. Picking up the cloak, she slung it around her shoulders and reached up to the sealed transparent lab packet containing the orchid, slipping it free from the cables that pinned it down. The orchid seemed to shiver and flatten its petals against the wall of the chamber closest to her hands, as if drawn to the warmth. It was murmuring to itself, not out loud but in her mind, in one of 1,000 languages that she didn't understand, an obscure tongue of hums and hisses. She stepped out into a long, narrow corridor, lit by irregular panels of interior lights, and followed it forward through another open hatch. Here the walkway narrowed even further. The ceiling lowered until she thought she'd somehow gone the wrong way. Hunching her shoulders to negotiate a turn, Zoe realized how truly cold it was. An abrupt blast of Arctic air slashed across her face and forearms, and she turned, open-mouthed and startled, tasting the first iron-flecked coldness in the back of her throat. White flakes swirled up the landing ramp, and in the sickish pale green glow of the landing lights, she got her first look at where they'd settled. They weren't sitting on any kind of pad. If it was out there, they'd missed it completely. The landscape outside the ship presented little more than a broad, snow-seethed steppe of white on white. The wind brought a thin film of tears to her eyes, and Zoe wiped them clear. In the distance, across the void, she could just make out the jagged peaks cutting upward like a black spinal column. There was something both erratic and oddly deliberate in the outline of those mountains. An instant later, she realized what it was. They weren't mountains at all. She tried to swallow and felt no moisture in her throat. The freezing dry air had sucked it away, eliminated it entirely. In her arms, tucked against her, the orchid had started to make the same repetitive clicking sound over and over again, as if it were stuck on a thought, a compulsive stammering noise that she didn't like at all. The tip of a spear touched the back of her neck. just above the rough hem of the collar. "Move," Tolk's voice said from behind her. Zoe's feet wouldn't budge. They seemed to have been riveted in place. "Wait," she said, not turning around. "Those black shapes out there, in the distance. They're—" "I know what they are." "Which planet is this?" she asked thinly. "Ziost?" The spear tip slipped a little against her skin, but it didn't hurt. She was far too lost in what lay in front of them to feel the pain. "We shouldn't have come," she said. "There's a toxicity level that I can't account for. It's—"
"Move."
"Do you have a droid you could send out to sample the atmosphere? Just to make sure?" The spear tip pushed harder, insisting. Hurting now. Zoe started down the landing ramp. Fresh kills or not, she was immediately grateful for the boots and skins. The heavy fur pelt piled around her shoulders and around her neck. The snow wasn't deep. In many places, its crust was firm enough that they could actually walk on top of it. But the wind was surgical, a precision instrument with needles for teeth, and it found even the tiniest exposed places on her skin, attacking them. In minutes, her face was a numb mask, her cheeks heavy and lifeless. She fixed her stare on the black crooked spine of peaks on the horizon. They were closer now, and any initial resemblance to mountains had long since vanished. The ruins and escarpments had a crudely mechanized appearance, and the resulting sprawl looked as if the massive skeleton of some ancient machine, city-sized, planet-sized, had been half buried here, abandoned while it was still alive enough to dig itself out. In the midst of it, like some pivot upon which it all turned, a great black tower. It rose up crookedly, a sloping monolithic pile constructed of sleek black rock, the grave marker of some long-dead deity. Even from here, its height dwarfed the half-ruined complex below. A good pilot could have parked a long-range freighter atop its flat roof. Red lights swarmed and shimmered inside its upper levels, their erratic patterns flooding the cloud of snowfall in a deep, arterial glow. It was like watching a digitized readout of a brain going insane and dying. The crunch of Tolk's footsteps faltered and slowed to a halt, and Zoe lowered her gaze to what lay immediately before them. 20 meters ahead, the ground dipped, and a kind of crude gateway rose up, webbed with clots of ice. She was aware of a silence here, the wind shearing abruptly away, leaving them in a pocket of utter quiet. Zoe took a breath and held it, then finally spoke aloud the words that had been haunting her since she first emerged from the bounty hunter's ship. "This is a Sith Academy." The whip had marched on, the unspoken silence of his confirmation hitting her even harder than she had anticipated. "What planet is this?" He ignored her. "Why are we here?" He skulked past her to the gate. Despite his size and imposing stature, there was a hesitation to his approach, as if he didn't know quite what to expect beyond this point. "It's the Orchid, isn't it?" Tolk turned back to her, spear in hand. She saw knots of ice dangling from his hair. His eyes were lost in shadow. "You are right to be afraid," she said. "Whatever's inside there is worse than you can possibly imagine. I'm only trying to warn you," she went on. "You know I'm a Jedi. I can feel—" Something happened then, some truncation of motion, as if time itself had been tricked, cheated out of its rightful due. Before she knew it, an icicle of pain, a single radial spike jagged upward into the underside of her chin, and when Zoe opened her eyes, she saw Tolk standing directly in front of her. The sharp part of the spear thrust upward into her flesh, biting in, drawing blood. He had moved faster than she'd ever imagined, faster even than her enhanced powers of perception could quite register. Zoe pulled back, freeing herself. "What do the Sith want with the Murakami Orchid?" Tolk blinked at her once, slowly, the blink of a creature that preferred to spend its time alone. "You can tell me now," she said, "or you can kill me. But I'm letting you know, I'm not going another step without knowing what's waiting for me in there." She thought about everything she'd heard of the academies. hives of darkness so black and toxic that they blazed with their own special kind of evil, unimaginable to those who'd never witnessed it firsthand. Even those darkest of places seemed clean compared with the rancid feeling of contamination wafting out from in front of these peculiar, half-ravaged structures, their slabs and the black tower overhead. "But you already know the orchid can't live without me." For a long time, Tolk didn't answer. So long, in fact, that Zoe wondered if he planned on ignoring her entirely. A moment later, though, he spoke.
"Have you heard of Darth Scabrous?"
Zoe felt something clenching deep in her chest. It was familiar, this tightness, like an emotional echo of some long-forgotten childhood fear. She remembered feeling it the moment the ship landed, and now it had a name. Darth Scabrous. She felt her gaze sucked inexorably back towards the tower.
"He wants the plant,"
Tolk said.
"I'm bringing it to him. That's the job I was hired to do."
"I see."
"No,"
Tolk said.
"You don't."
He shook his head.
"But you will."
Zoe tried to speak, but all that came out was a croak. Tolk stared at her from the other end of the spear, the inarticulate ultimatum communicating more than words ever could. A moment later, she stepped through the gateway.